Under the darkened skies of late 18th century Europe, a storm was gathering. In Paris, crowds thronged the squares, their voices rising in chants of liberty and fraternity. The heavy blade of the guillotine fell again and again, its sound carrying across cobblestones and through palace walls, a sound that seemed to shake the continent itself. Where kings had long ruled with unquestioned authority, there was now only uncertainty. The tricolor flag, red, white, and blue, whipped in the wind, declaring that the old world was ending and a new, untested order had begun. This was no ordinary upheaval. The French Revolution of 1789 had ripped through Europe's ancient order, tearing at the roots of monarchy, aristocracy, and privilege. In Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, rulers who had once believed themselves secure suddenly trembled at the thought that the cries of Paris might echo in their own streets. The revolution was not just a French affair, it was a contagion, an idea that leapt across borders faster than any army could march. Europe had known dynastic wars and religious wars, but this was a war of ideas, and its consequences promised to be far greater. Across the Channel, Britain watched with unease. The island kingdom seemed secure, its navy unmatched, its empire sprawling across oceans and continents. London bustled with commerce. Gold poured in from trade, and the confidence of maritime power ran deep. Yet all of that strength did not silence the unease, for across the narrow waters, a new kind of leader was rising from the chaos. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born a Corsican outsider, sharp-eyed and restless, and he had climbed with astonishing speed. From the smoke of battlefields in Italy to the council chambers of Paris, his rise was relentless. By 1799, he had seized the reins of France as first consul, and soon he would crown himself emperor. He was not merely a general, he was a phenomenon, a man who seemed to shape events rather than be shaped by them. His campaigns electrified the world. Armies moved at his command with a speed and precision Europe had never seen. To France, he was the restorer of order and glory. To Britain, he was a storm made flesh. The Channel became the line between survival and conquest. Napoleon dreamed of crossing it, of bringing Britain to its knees. The British, in turn, trusted their wooden walls, the ships of the Royal Navy, to hold him at bay. Each side measured the other with wary eyes, knowing that the struggle ahead would not be brief. What was beginning was not a single war, but a series of wars that would last more than 20 years, consuming nations, reshaping alliances, and redrawing maps. For Britain, these conflicts would become something far greater than battles fought abroad. They would test the resilience of its economy, the steadiness of its politics, the courage of its armies, and the unity of its people. Out of those tests, Britain would be changed forever. It would emerge not only as the power that stood against Napoleon, but as the nation that forged a new sense of itself, a modern identity born in fire and trial. Imagine Europe as a vast stage. On one side, Napoleon rides forward, the embodiment of France's revolutionary energy turned imperial ambition. On the other, Britain, steadfast and unyielding, its fate tied to the winds and waves that carried its navy. Between them lies the narrow sea, a barrier and a lifeline. The clash between these two forces was inevitable, and the world braced for it. The story of the Napoleonic Wars is a story of battles that still echo in memory. Trafalgar, where the seas thundered and Nelson secured Britain's command of the oceans. The Peninsular War, where Wellington's steady hand ground down French power in Spain. Waterloo, where the fate of Europe rested on a single June day. But beyond the battles, it is the story of how Britain endured, adapted, and emerged transformed. It is the story of how a nation under pressure was remade by its trials. The wars burdened Britain with debt, but they also spurred industry and innovation. They strained its politics, but they laid the groundwork for reform. They pressed upon society, but they strengthened the idea of resilience and national identity. And when they ended, Britain stood not merely victorious, but ascendant, ready to shape the century that lay ahead. To understand how Britain became the global power of the 19th century, one must begin here, in the storm of the Napoleonic Wars. These conflicts were not fleeting. They were the crucible in which modern Britain was forged. And as we follow the course of this epic struggle, we discover not only the rise and fall of an extraordinary man, but the endurance of a people who faced him. If you are drawn to the great currents of history, to the stories of empires and nations, of triumphs and trials that still shape the world we live in, then continue this journey. What lies ahead is more than the record of battles long past. It is the story of a defining age, the story of the Napoleonic Wars, and of Britain's hour of destiny. The storm that had gathered over Europe was no passing squall. What began as chants in Parisian squares and the fall of a king soon grew into a continental crisis. The guillotine's echo did not remain in France alone. It reverberated through palaces in Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. Petersburg striking fear into monarchs who had once seemed untouchable. The revolution born in France now cast its shadow across the whole of Europe. And as the tricolor flag waved defiantly above Paris, the old order realized that its survival was no longer guaranteed. The storm that had begun in Paris soon tore through the very heart of Europe. The Bourbon dynasty, once the embodiment of monarchy's grandeur, crumbled before the fury of the revolution. The fall of Louis XVI was more than the toppling of a king. It was a signal that the old order could be broken, that crowns could be cast aside as swiftly as the turning of a page. Across the continent, palaces that had stood for centuries quaked with unease. Ministers whispered, monarchs panicked, and every ruler asked the same question. If France could fall, who might be next? For the conservative courts of Europe, the revolution was not merely a neighbor's misfortune, it was a contagion. From Vienna to Berlin, from St. Petersburg to London, governments feared that ideas of liberty and equality might seep into their own streets, igniting unrest among their people. To them, the revolution was not an experiment, but a threat to the entire fabric of society. And so, alliances were forged not out of shared ambition, but out of shared fear. Austria, custodian of Habsburg tradition, Prussia, eager to defend its authority, Russia, determined to shield its empire from dangerous ideas, and Britain, the island kingdom across the Channel, each resolved to resist this upheaval. Thus were born the first coalitions against revolutionary France. Armies marched under banners proclaiming the defense of order, determined to crush the Republic before it could take root. Yet France, driven by fervor and desperation, fought with a zeal that astonished its enemies. What had seemed to be a faltering state transformed into a nation in arms. Generals rose from obscurity. Soldiers marched with conviction, and France not only survived but struck back, driving its foes from its borders and redrawing the map of Europe. In this clash, Britain assumed a role unlike any other. Its army was modest compared to the massed hosts of Austria or Russia, and its distance from the continental battlefields limited its direct intervention. But Britain possessed something more enduring than manpower. It possessed wealth. London's banks and the prosperity of its trade made Britain the great financier of Europe's resistance. Gold flowed from the coffers of Westminster into the hands of allies, funding campaigns, raising armies, and sustaining coalitions that might otherwise have faltered. It was said, not without truth, that Britain fought Napoleon as much with its money as with its muskets. This strategy was both shrewd and essential, for while France could harness the energy of revolution to create massive citizen armies, Britain could not rely on sheer numbers. Its strength lay on the seas and in its ability to outlast any rival through commerce, industry, and finance. By paying its allies to keep French forces occupied on land, Britain ensured that its navy could dominate the waters, protect its trade, and strangle the economy of its enemy. The island kingdom became, in effect, the banker of Europe's wars, transforming wealth into weapons, coin into coalitions. The other monarchies often underestimated this role. They looked to the battlefield, to cavalry charges and artillery barrages, measuring success in miles gained or cities captured. Britain measured success in endurance. As long as gold could be sent across Europe, as long as ships could sail with goods and supplies, the struggle against France could continue. It was not the most dramatic of strategies, but it was one that proved decisive. And so, from the ashes of Bourbon monarchy and the panic of conservative courts, a new kind of war emerged. It was not only a clash of swords and cannons, but a contest of resources, will, and ideas. France fought for survival and expansion, armed with the zeal of revolution. The coalition fought for preservation, desperate to protect the old order from collapse. Britain, standing slightly apart, yet deeply entangled, poured its treasure into the scales, determined to tip the balance against its formidable foe. The fire kindled in Paris had become a blaze consuming all of Europe. Yet amid the flames, Britain began to see its role more clearly, not just as a participant in the conflict, but as the indispensable power whose endurance, wealth, and navy would shape the outcome of the struggle. The storm was far from over, and the man who would soon dominate it had only just stepped into the light. Yet even as coalitions rose and fell, even as Britain poured its gold across Europe and navies clashed upon the seas, a new force was gathering within France itself. Out of the turbulence of revolution and the fire of war, one man began to rise above the chaos, a figure whose ambition and genius would soon eclipse kings and confound coalitions. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and with his arrival the struggle entered an entirely new dimension. Out of the fire of revolution emerged a figure who would soon dominate not only France but all of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the rugged island of Corsica, seemed at first an unlikely candidate to shape the destiny of nations. He was young, ambitious, and restless, a man who saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. Trained as an artillery officer, he possessed both a keen mathematical mind and an instinct for command. In the confusion of the Revolutionary Wars, where generals rose and fell with dizzying speed, Napoleon seized his chance. His rise began in Italy. Sent to command the Army of Italy in 1796, he found a force poorly equipped and demoralized. With relentless energy, he transformed it. He led his soldiers through the Alps with daring maneuvers, moving faster than his opponents believed possible. In a series of dazzling campaigns, he struck Austrian forces again and again, cutting them off from supply lines, forcing them into retreat, and delivering victories that electrified France. At every turn, his strategy was the same: rapid marches, concentrated attacks, and bold risks that seemed reckless until they brought triumph. His enemies called him unpredictable. His men called him a genius. From Italy, he moved to Egypt, an expedition that aimed to strike at British influence in the East. Though the campaign faltered against the power of the Royal Navy, it demonstrated Napoleon's ambition. He thought not merely of battlefields but of empires, not merely of victory but of destiny. Returning to France in 1799, he found the government weakened, mistrusted, and ripe for change. The revolution had devoured its leaders, and the people longed for order. Napoleon offered more than promises. He offered certainty, discipline, and vision. In a swift coup d'etat, he became first consul, and with that, the revolution passed into a new phase. France had found not just a leader, but a master. Once in power, Napoleon set about reshaping the machinery of war. He reorganized the army into corps, flexible units that could march independently, yet join together in battle with devastating effect. He emphasized speed, striking before opponents could unite against him. Soldiers under his command marched further, faster, and with greater cohesion than any other army in Europe. "Speed is everything," he declared, and on campaign he proved it. His armies appeared where they were least expected, struck with thunderous force, and disappeared before the enemy could recover. To his foes, it was as if a storm had swept across the continent, unpredictable, overwhelming, impossible to contain. It was this combination of rapid movement and decisive engagement that earned him the reputation as the thunderbolt of Europe. But Napoleon was not only a tactician, he was also a master of morale. He spoke to his soldiers with words that inflamed loyalty and pride. "Every soldier carries a marshal's baton in his knapsack," he told them, suggesting that glory and advancement lay within reach of all. In a France weary of revolution's uncertainty, his promise of greatness united the nation behind him. Under his leadership, victory after victory followed: Marengo in 1800, Austerlitz in 1805, Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. With each triumph, his legend grew. Across the Channel, Britain watched with growing alarm. At first, Napoleon seemed simply another strongman rising from the ruins of the Revolution, but his successes revealed something more dangerous. He was not a fleeting figure. He was a force that could remake the balance of Europe. Britain's leaders began to see him not just as a rival, but as an existential threat. If Napoleon succeeded in uniting the continent under French domination, what chance would Britain have, isolated on its island, however mighty its navy? The British press called him a menace to civilization, a tyrant in waiting, a man whose ambition knew no bounds. Ministers debated how to contain him, through coalitions, through blockades, through the Navy's command of the seas. Yet even as they plotted, Napoleon advanced. He restructured laws through the Napoleonic Code, reshaped administration, and bound France together under his authority. He was not merely waging war, he was building a system, a new order in Europe, one that could challenge Britain not only on the battlefield, but in every sphere of influence. To the British mind, this was the ultimate test. Napoleon represented the most formidable enemy the nation had faced since the days of the Spanish Armada. He was brilliant, relentless, and willing to gamble everything for victory. His armies stretched from Lisbon to Warsaw. His influence touched from Berlin to Naples. Britain, with its fleet, its commerce, and its gold, stood as the last great obstacle to his vision of continental dominance. Thus, the stage was set. On one side stood Napoleon, the master of land warfare, the architect of speed and surprise. On the other stood Britain, ruler of the seas, the banker of coalitions, determined to resist at any cost. Their confrontation would define an era, shaping not only the fate of Europe, but the very identity of Britain itself. While Napoleon reshaped France into an empire of order and ambition, across the Channel, Britain confronted its own crucible. The rise of this formidable adversary cast a long shadow over London, forcing the government not only to measure its strength abroad, but also to reckon with unrest at home. As Napoleon prepared to test Europe on the battlefield, Britain, under William Pitt the Younger, prepared to defend its survival through vigilance, endurance, and the steady power of the sea. While Napoleon consolidated power across the Channel, Britain faced its own trials at home. The government was led by William Pitt the Younger, a statesman whose intellect was matched by his youth. Pitt had first taken office at the age of just 24, astonishing friend and foe alike. By the time the French Revolution unfolded, he was already an experienced leader, pragmatic in policy and cautious in temperament. Yet nothing in his early career could fully prepare him for the scale of the crisis now looming over Britain. The revolution in France had not only shaken Europe's monarchies, it had also stirred the imagination of ordinary Britons. Pamphlets circulated proclaiming the rights of man, secret clubs debated the promise of liberty, and some radicals called openly for reforms that mirrored those in Paris. The Jacobin movement, though smaller in Britain than in France, nonetheless alarmed the government. To Pitt and his ministers, these whispers threatened to spread unrest, perhaps even rebellion, at a time when unity was essential. Social strains ran deep. The late 18th century had brought economic hardship to many, worsened by the costs of war and the disruptions of trade. Prices of food rose, wages stagnated, and the common people grew restless. Demonstrations and protests appeared in towns and cities, and while most were peaceful, they carried an edge of danger in a nation already on edge. To the governing elite, these movements seemed like sparks that could ignite into something far greater. Pitt's response was firm. His government tightened laws against sedition, restricted public gatherings, and cracked down on radical publishers. Habeas corpus was suspended at times, and critics accused him of sacrificing liberty to maintain order. Yet Pitt believed that survival came first. Britain was not only fighting a war abroad, it was fighting for stability within. In his view, if France represented revolution, then Britain must represent endurance, even if it meant stern measures at home. At the same time, Pitt understood that Britain's greatest strength lay not in armies marching across Europe, but in ships sailing the seas. The Royal Navy was the shield and sword of the kingdom. Against Napoleon's rising power, Britain would not rely on massive continental armies, but on command of the oceans. Control of the seas meant control of trade, the ability to choke France's economy, and the guarantee that no invasion fleet could safely cross the Channel. Thus emerged Britain's strategy of blockade. It was a weapon not of immediate spectacle, but of steady, relentless pressure. The Navy patrolled the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the North Sea, intercepting French and Allied ships, cutting off supplies and isolating ports. For Britain, the blockade became the cornerstone of its war effort, a silent siege conducted not with walls and trenches, but with sails and broadsides. It demanded discipline, endurance, and resources, but it struck at the very foundation of Napoleon's ambitions. The commitment to naval supremacy also reflected Britain's identity. An island nation could never rely on numbers alone. It relied instead on mastery of the waters. In every port city, from Portsmouth to Liverpool, the people understood that their fate depended on the Navy. Every new ship launched was celebrated as a weapon of survival, every victory at sea seen as a safeguard of the nation's independence. For Pitt's government, investing in the fleet was not simply policy, it was destiny. Yet the early years of war tested this resolve. The strain of financing allies, maintaining the blockade, and suppressing unrest at home stretched Britain's resources thin. Critics within Parliament accused Pitt of overreaching, of risking bankruptcy and civil strife in pursuit of a continental struggle that seemed endless. But Pitt's vision was unyielding. He believed that Britain could outlast Napoleon not by matching him army for army, but by combining financial strength with naval dominance. Gold would keep allies in the field. The Navy would keep Britain secure. It was a gamble, but one grounded in Britain's unique position. While other powers rose and fell with the fortunes of battle, Britain anchored itself in endurance. Its fleet guarded the homeland, its commerce fueled the treasury, and its blockade slowly strangled the enemy. Pitt, though often weary and burdened, never wavered in this conviction. In these first years of conflict, as France surged forward under Napoleon's command, Britain steeled itself for a long struggle. Its people endured restrictions, its leaders faced criticism, yet the nation held firm. Out of hardship and vigilance, Britain discovered a strategy that would define its role in the wars to come. Not a swift clash of armies, but a long contest of will, sustained by the wooden walls of its navy and the determination of its government. The island kingdom, threatened yet unbroken, had chosen its path. The storm over Europe would rage on, but Britain had set its course, resolved to fight not only for victory, but for survival itself. Yet ships alone, however mighty, needed hands to guide them and vision to wield their strength. Strategy in Whitehall and coins from the treasury could sustain the war, but it was on the rolling decks of oak and canvas that Britain's fate would ultimately be decided. And in that arena, one man rose to embody the very spirit of the nation at sea. From obscurity he emerged, frail in body yet fierce in will, destined to become the face of Britain's defiance against Napoleon, Horatio Nelson. From the storm of revolution and the rise of Napoleon, Britain's answer did not come from Parliament alone, or from the weight of gold sent to allies. It came from the sea, from the decks of oak ships rolling in the Atlantic swell, and from the steady hand of a commander whose very name became inseparable from his nation's survival. Horatio Nelson, son of a Norfolk clergyman, would rise from obscurity to embody the spirit of Britain at war. Nelson's path to legend began humbly. Born in 1758, frail in health but fierce in determination, he entered the Royal Navy as a boy of 12. Life at sea hardened him quickly. He endured storms, long voyages, and the rigid discipline of naval service. Yet he showed an uncommon talent for leadership. Courage, daring, and an instinct for bold maneuver set him apart from his peers. By the time France erupted in revolution, Nelson had already established himself as an officer who sought not safety, but opportunity. Willing to risk much in pursuit of decisive victory, the true measure of his genius came in 1798 at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon, having carried his armies to Egypt, threatened Britain's hold over Mediterranean trade routes and, potentially, the jewel of its empire, India. The French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay, seemingly secure. But Nelson, after a relentless search, found them and attacked with an audacity that stunned both friend and foe. Defying convention, he led his ships between the shore and the French line, striking from a position thought impossible. Cannons roared across the night sky, and by dawn the French fleet was shattered. Napoleon's dream of controlling the East collapsed with it. For Britain, the victory at the Nile was more than a battle won. It was a turning point. Nelson had proved that the Royal Navy could not only defend but dominate, crushing threats before they reached Britain's shores. Nelson's reputation soared, and with it, his role as the face of national resistance. Yet he was not content to rest on past triumphs. In 1801, he, once again, displayed both audacity and independence at the Battle of Copenhagen. Tasked with breaking Denmark's alliance with Napoleon, Nelson sailed into a harbor bristling with coastal defenses. The attack faltered at first, and signals from the commander-in-chief ordered a retreat. Nelson, putting his telescope to his blind eye, famously declared he could not see the signal. He pressed the assault, turning near defeat into resounding victory. Denmark sued for peace, and Britain secured its northern flank. These battles revealed not only Nelson's tactical brilliance, but also his character. He was daring, yet deeply human, inspiring loyalty among sailors who saw in him not a distant figure of authority, but a leader who shared their dangers. He was wounded repeatedly in service, losing an arm and the sight in one eye, yet returned to duty each time, undaunted. His physical sacrifices became symbols of his devotion, proof that he bore the burdens of war alongside his men. To a nation searching for heroes, Nelson became the very embodiment of courage. But Nelson was more than a commander. He was a symbol. His victories at the Nile and Copenhagen were celebrated in streets and taverns, sung in ballads, painted on canvases. He became a living legend. His name invoked as a reassurance that Britain's fate was safe, so long as he commanded the seas. In Parliament, his triumphs gave weight to Pitt's strategy of blockade. In homes across the island, mothers told their children of the admiral who never flinched. Nelson's image, frail in body, yet indomitable in spirit, mirrored the nation itself, small compared to the continental might of Napoleon, yet unyielding in resolve. By the dawn of the 19th century, Nelson stood as the nation's greatest weapon, his very presence a deterrent to enemies and a beacon to allies. His victories had preserved Britain's control of the Mediterranean, secured its trade routes, and reassured its people that the Channel would not be crossed. Yet the greatest test still lay ahead. As Napoleon prepared once more to challenge Britain at sea, the admiral from Norfolk would soon face the battle that would define not only his life, but the destiny of Europe. By the dawn of the 19th century, Nelson's victories had made him more than a commander. He was the living symbol of Britain's defiance. Yet both he and his nation knew that the greatest test still lay ahead. Across the Channel, Napoleon gathered his fleets and armies, dreaming of an invasion that would humble the island kingdom at last. It was on the waves of the Atlantic, in a clash long anticipated, that Nelson would face his destiny, and Britain would fight for its very survival. The ocean groaned beneath heavy swells as October winds tore across the Bay of Cadiz. Dark clouds pressed low, the Atlantic heaved, and sails strained against the gale. On the horizon, two fleets inched toward a collision that would decide the fate of empires. Across the decks of Britain's ships, the Union Jack snapped sharply in the storm, its colors visible even through the haze. And on the flagship Victory, Admiral Horatio Nelson gave the words that would forever echo in national memory. England expects that every man will do his duty. This was Trafalgar, October 21st, 1805, the moment when Napoleon's dream of invading Britain met the unforgiving power of the sea. For months, the French emperor had sought a way to break through. His plan was audacious: concentrate the French and Spanish fleets, lure the Royal Navy away, and clear a path for his invasion force. Across the Channel, an army of over 100,000 men waited, encamped along the French coast. Flat-bottom boats had been built, ready to carry them across the narrow waters to the green fields of England. If the fleet succeeded, Britain itself would lie exposed. But Napoleon's strategy depended on precision and coordination, qualities that faltered when tested against Britain's mastery of the seas. French squadrons were scattered, communications delayed, and morale shaken. By the time the combined fleet of France and Spain emerged from Cadiz, Nelson was ready. He had studied their movements, anticipated their intentions, and prepared to deliver a blow from which they would not recover. Nelson's approach to battle defied convention. Naval warfare traditionally meant ships forming long parallel lines, exchanging broadsides in cautious duels. Nelson rejected this. He would not fight to stalemate. He would fight to annihilate. Dividing his fleet into two columns, he aimed to cut directly through the enemy line, splitting it into fragments, surrounding sections, and destroying them piecemeal. It was a plan of calculated risk, one that demanded the utmost discipline and courage from every sailor. As the fleets closed, tension hung in the salt air. The British ships advanced steadily, sails full, cannons silent until the moment of impact. Men tightened ropes, loaded powder, and looked to the quarterdeck where Nelson stood calm, his gaze fixed on the enemy line. In his cabin, he had dressed carefully that morning, not in plain uniform, but in full admiral's attire, medals gleaming. He understood the danger and perhaps the fate awaiting him, yet he embraced it with the serenity of one who believed in destiny. The clash came with thunder. Victory drove into the line, raking the French flagship Bucentaure with a devastating broadside. Ships locked in desperate struggle, their timbers shuddering under the storm of cannon fire. Through smoke and spray, the Union Jack waved defiantly, as if to answer Napoleon's challenge. Around Nelson, captains pressed forward, their ships forcing gaps, their guns unleashing destruction. The sea roared, the sky dimmed with smoke, and the battle raged in close quarters. For hours, Trafalgar was chaos, sails torn to shreds, masts collapsing, the din of battle shaking the very ocean. Yet within the chaos lay order, Nelson's plan unfolding with ruthless precision. The Franco-Spanish line fractured, its coordination dissolved. Individual ships fought bravely, but the British pressed relentlessly, isolating opponents and overwhelming them, one by one. The courage of Britain's sailors, their discipline and training, carried the day. And then came the moment that sealed Trafalgar in memory. Amidst the storm of battle, Nelson was struck down on the deck of Victory. He was carried below, mortally wounded, but even in his final hours he asked only of the fight. "How goes the battle?" he whispered, and when told that victory was certain, he murmured the words that became his epitaph. "Thank God I have done my duty." Above, the fleet pressed on, the Union Jack still flying, as if in salute to its fallen commander. Nelson's death transformed Trafalgar from victory into legend. He became the immortal hero, the admiral who gave his life at the very moment of triumph. Britain mourned, but it also exulted, for in sacrifice he became the embodiment of national spirit. He was gone, yet he lived in memory, in song, in the pride of a people who believed that his courage now flowed through them all. The consequences of Trafalgar were immense. The combined French and Spanish fleets were shattered, 22 ships captured or destroyed, none of the British lost. More than numbers, it was the strategic reality that mattered. Napoleon's invasion plans were broken. Never again would he attempt to cross the Channel. Britain's command of the seas was assured, its shores secure, its empire free to expand across the globe. Trafalgar sealed the island's safety for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars. For Napoleon, the defeat was permanent. He would dominate on land, from Austerlitz to Jena, reshaping Europe with his armies. But the sea remained closed. Every campaign, every strategy, every ambition was limited by Britain's naval supremacy. The blockade would tighten, trade would suffer, and France's reach would always be checked by the power of the Royal Navy. Trafalgar had drawn a line across history. The Emperor of France would never be the master of the oceans. In Britain, Trafalgar became more than a victory. It was a national myth. The words signaled from victory that morning, "England expects that every man will do his duty," became a creed repeated by generations. Nelson's statue would rise over London, his image engraved into the identity of the nation. Trafalgar was not just a battle won, it was a declaration that Britain's destiny lay upon the seas, and that no conqueror, however brilliant, could breach its walls of oak and iron. Thus, on that October day in 1805, as the Atlantic winds howled and the sea boiled with fury, the fate of empires was decided. Britain emerged not only undefeated, but unassailable, its navy unchallenged, its people united in pride and purpose. And though Nelson himself did not live to see the dawn after victory, his spirit remained, a reminder that duty, courage, and sacrifice could shape the destiny of nations. Trafalgar was his gift to Britain, and through it, he achieved what few mortals ever do. He became eternal. Trafalgar had secured Britain's command of the seas, but victory did not end the struggle. Napoleon remained master of the continent, and though his fleets lay shattered, his armies marched unchallenged across Europe. If the channel could not be crossed by force, the war would find a new front, one of trade, commerce, and endurance. Out of the silence that followed Trafalgar's thunder, a different kind of battle began, the blockade. In the wake of Trafalgar, the thunder of cannon gave way to a quieter, but no less decisive form of struggle. Britain, secure behind its navy, turned increasingly to economic warfare. If Napoleon's armies ruled the land, then Britain would rule the sea, and through mastery of the oceans, it sought to strangle the lifeblood of his empire. The Royal Navy spread its blockade across the coasts of Europe, sealing ports from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Merchant ships attempting to trade with France were intercepted, their cargoes seized, their voyages halted. It was a war not of battles, but of endurance, a relentless tightening of chains that sought to cut France off from global commerce. Napoleon, ever resourceful, refused to yield. In 1806, he declared the Continental System, a sweeping edict intended to close the markets of Europe to British goods. Ports under French control, from Lisbon to Hamburg, were ordered to turn away British merchants. Neutral states were pressed to comply. The emperor imagined an economic fortress stretching across the continent, where British commerce would wither and its economy collapse. To his mind, if he could not defeat the Royal Navy in open battle, he would crush Britain through isolation. Yet the struggle between blockade and system proved more complex than either side imagined. Britain, with its colonies and trading partners across the globe, found new markets in the Americas, in Asia, and in the far-flung corners of empire. Its navy ensured that goods could flow even if Europe closed its doors. France, meanwhile, discovered that enforcing the continental system was nearly impossible. Smuggling flourished, merchants bribed officials, and even Napoleon's allies chafed at restrictions that hurt their own prosperity. Instead of crippling Britain, the system often weakened the economies of Europe itself. The consequences rippled far beyond Europe's shores. Prices of sugar, coffee, and grain shifted with every disruption of trade. In the Caribbean, in India, in South America, fortunes rose and fell depending on which navy controlled the seas that month. The world economy, increasingly tied to Britain's maritime networks, felt the tremors of this great contest. What began as a clash of fleets had become a global struggle for markets and resources, a war fought as much in counting houses and ports as on battlefields. For Britain, the blockade became proof of its naval supremacy. It could not always defeat Napoleon's armies in the fields of Europe, but it could keep his empire suffocated, its ports silent, its merchants frustrated. For Napoleon, the failure of the continental system revealed the limits of even his vast power. He could conquer cities and crown kings, but he could not command the tides nor silence the ships that carried Britain's wealth. Thus the war entered a new phase, where sales and tariffs became weapons, and the contest for dominance extended to every shore the sea could touch. It was a battle of patience, of resilience, of endurance, and in that battle, Britain held the advantage. Yet even as tariffs and blockades tightened the grip of war, another front was about to erupt, one that cannons and ships alone could not contain. In the rugged lands of the Iberian Peninsula, resistance flared with a force that neither Napoleon's decrees nor Britain's embargoes could suppress. What began as economic struggles soon spilled into open rebellion, and the fire that smoldered in Europe's markets now blazed across Spain's mountains and villages. In 1808, the fire of resistance that Napoleon had tried to smother across Europe flared with unexpected ferocity in the Iberian Peninsula. Spain, long thought a passive ally under the shadow of French power, erupted in revolt. The French had occupied the country under the pretense of alliance, marching their troops through Spanish territory to strike at Portugal. But when Napoleon placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, the people rose. From Madrid to the smallest mountain village, the Spanish declared that they would not be ruled by a foreign crown. The uprising was sudden, chaotic, and fierce. Ordinary citizens, peasants, priests, merchants took up whatever arms they could find. At Belen, in July 1808, a French army surrendered to a Spanish force, the first time Napoleon's legions had been humbled in open battle. News of the defeat spread across Europe like lightning, proving that even the seemingly invincible French could be resisted. For Napoleon, Spain was supposed to be a stepping stone. Instead, it became a quagmire. Sensing opportunity, Britain acted. For years, the island nation had been limited to blockades and financing allies, its army too small to challenge France directly on the continent. But Spain offered a new front, one where Britain could intervene with meaningful force. The Duke of Wellington, then Sir Arthur Wellesley, landed with an expeditionary army in Portugal. Calm, methodical, and iron-willed, Wellington would become the figure to match Napoleon in strategy and endurance. His early victories at Vimeiro and Talavera gave Britain a foothold, and with it a chance to challenge France on land as well as at sea. What made the Peninsular War unlike any other was not only the clash of regular armies, but the relentless war waged by the Spanish people themselves. Out of villages, mountains, and forests emerged the guerrilleros, fighters who struck suddenly and disappeared into the landscape. They ambushed convoys, harassed patrols, cut supply lines, and made every French march a trial. To Napoleon's disciplined armies, trained for grand maneuvers and set-piece battles, this kind of warfare was maddening. No victory seemed final, no town truly pacified. Every road could be a trap, every ally uncertain. Napoleon himself would call it the Spanish ulcer, a wound that drained his empire slowly but inexorably. For Britain, these guerrilla bands were invaluable. While Wellington's professional army held the main lines and fought set battles, the Spanish resistance ensured that French forces were constantly stretched thin. Entire divisions had to be diverted simply to guard supply routes, leaving fewer troops for the decisive encounters Napoleon needed. What might have been a swift conquest turned into a grinding war of attrition, fought in fields, hills, and villages across the peninsula. The human cost was immense, but so too was the psychological weight. The myth of French invincibility began to fracture. Soldiers who had once marched proudly under Napoleon's banners now found themselves demoralized, caught in a war with no clear front lines and no decisive end. In Paris, the emperor seethed, recognizing that Spain consumed resources he needed elsewhere. Armies sent to subdue the Iberian Peninsula numbered in the hundreds of thousands, yet still the war dragged on, bleeding France of men and morale. In Britain, by contrast, the war in Spain was celebrated as proof of resilience and hope. Dispatches of Wellington's victories stirred Parliament and heartened a weary public. Songs and ballads praised both the British soldier and the Spanish guerrilla, unlikely partners in a struggle for freedom. For the first time, Britain could point to solid gains on land against Napoleon, gains that could not easily be dismissed or reversed. The Peninsular War also revealed a new kind of warfare, one not decided by a single crushing battle, but by endurance, alliances, and the will of peoples refusing to be subdued. It marked the beginning of a shift, where Napoleon's aura of inevitability began to crack, and Britain's confidence began to grow. By 1812, when Napoleon turned his gaze eastward to Russia, Spain remained unconquered, its people still defiant, its mountains still alive with the sound of resistance. What Napoleon had once dismissed as a sideshow had become a bleeding sore, draining his empire of strength. For Britain, the Iberian Peninsula was not just another theater of war. It was the proving ground where its soldiers, under Wellington's unflinching command, stood firm against the might of France. And so, in the rugged hills of Spain and Portugal, amid guerrilla ambushes and Wellington's steady advance, the course of Europe began to shift. The ulcer that Napoleon could not heal became the wound that weakened his empire, while for Britain it was the place where survival turned to strength and where the long road to ultimate victory first truly began. Amid the ambushes of guerrillas and the chaos of rebellion, one figure began to stand apart, a commander whose discipline and patience offered Britain more than fleeting victories. The struggle in Spain was more than a proving ground. It was the stage upon which Arthur Wellesley, soon to be the Duke of Wellington, forged his reputation. From the hills of Portugal to the plains of Castile, his steady hand turned survival into triumph and his name into legend. From the rugged hills of Portugal and Spain emerged the figure who would become Britain's great commander on land, the man destined to balance Napoleon's genius with his own. Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, was not born into the fire of revolution like his adversary, but into the steady traditions of Anglo-Irish gentry, reserved in manner, meticulous in thought, and disciplined to the point of austerity. He seemed an unlikely hero compared to the flamboyant Napoleon or the romantic Nelson. Yet it was precisely his caution, his patience, and his iron will that made him the Iron Duke, the general who carried Britain's cause from survival to triumph. Wellesley was born in Dublin in 1769, the same year as Napoleon. His early years offered little sign of greatness. A shy boy, mocked for his reticence, he once confessed that he had no talent except perseverance, but perseverance in war can be more valuable than brilliance. Entering the army, he developed a methodical style of command, studious in preparation, precise in execution, reluctant to gamble unless the odds were firmly in his favor. While others sought glory, Wellesley sought certainty. This was the foundation of his leadership, a steadiness that would prove decisive in the long campaigns of the Peninsular War. His first major opportunity came in 1808 at the Battle of Vimeiro in Portugal. Tasked with halting the French advance, Wellesley chose his ground with care. He placed his troops on high ridges, maximizing the effectiveness of their disciplined volleys. When French columns attacked, the British line held firm, unleashing controlled fire that shattered the assaults. The victory was clear, though subsequent political interference denied Wellesley the chance to capitalize fully. Yet Vimeiro announced his arrival. Here was a commander who could withstand the French onslaught and give as good as he received. 2 years later, at Talavera in 1809, Wellesley's reputation deepened. Facing a French force nearly double his size, he again relied on discipline and terrain. The battle was brutal in its intensity, the Spanish allies unreliable, yet Wellesley's army held. Though technically indecisive, Talavera gave Britain the moral victory it craved. London hailed him as a hero, granting him a peerage, Viscount Wellington. From that day forward, his name was tied irrevocably to the struggle against Napoleon. But it was in the years that followed, at Salamanca and Vittoria, that Wellington's genius came fully into view. In 1812, at Salamanca, he seized a fleeting opportunity. Spotting a gap as French troops redeployed, Wellington ordered an immediate attack, driving into the enemy's flank with precision. What followed was one of the most decisive victories of the war, a triumph that forced the French to retreat from central Spain. Wellington's caution had not dulled his eye for opportunity. When the moment came, he struck with speed and certainty. The climax of his peninsular campaigns came the following year, at the Battle of Vittoria in 1813. Facing King Joseph Bonaparte and a French army tasked with holding Spain, Wellington unleashed a coordinated assault across a broad front. His troops advanced relentlessly, rolling up French positions, capturing baggage, and breaking their control over the peninsula. Napoleon's grip on Spain was broken. The Spanish ulcer had become a mortal wound. For Britain, Vittoria was a triumph, not just of arms, but of strategy. Wellington had proven that disciplined planning, patience, and steadfastness could overcome the brilliance of French maneuver. What made Wellington remarkable was not only his victories, but the style in which he achieved them. He was not beloved like Nelson, nor flamboyant like Napoleon. He kept himself aloof from his men, rarely indulging in theatrics. Yet his soldiers respected him deeply, for they knew he would never waste their lives needlessly. He was cautious to the point of exasperating his allies, but his caution ensured survival against formidable odds. He preferred to fight defensive battles, forcing the French to attack uphill against steady lines of British fire. But when opportunity arose, he struck with devastating decisiveness. Wellington's genius lay in balance. He was not a gambler, but neither was he timid. He endured the long years of attrition in Portugal and Spain, husbanding his strength, waiting for the French to overextend, and then striking where it mattered most. It was this resilience, this refusal to be rushed, that earned him the admiration of his countrymen and the respect of his enemies. In Britain's imagination, Nelson and Wellington soon became twin pillars of national pride. Nelson, the sailor hero, fiery and daring, who gave his life at Trafalgar. Wellington, the soldier statesman, cool and calculating, who ground down Napoleon's power on land. One embodied the restless energy of the sea, the other the steady endurance of the earth. Together, they symbolized Britain's ability to resist, to endure, and ultimately to prevail. By the end of the Peninsular War, Wellington had become more than a general. He was a national figure, a man whose iron character mirrored the resilience of his nation. In the fields of Spain, he had shown that Britain could match Napoleon not only on the sea, but also on the land. His campaigns gave Britain the confidence to stand as a continental power, paving the way for the final confrontation that awaited on the fields of Belgium. Thus, from the quiet determination of his youth to the resounding victories of Salamanca and Vittoria, Wellington forged his legend. He was not a man of rhetoric or romance, but of discipline, precision, and iron resolve. And in that resolve lay Britain's greatest strength. For while Nelson had secured the seas, Wellington secured the ground upon which Napoleon's empire began to crumble. The Iron Duke and the fallen admiral, each in their own realm, together ensured that Britain would endure the storm and emerge not merely unbroken, but ascendant. Wellington's triumphs were not confined to the fields of Spain. Their echoes rolled across the Channel, stirring Britain itself. Each dispatch from the peninsula carried more than news of battle. It carried hope, pride, and the weight of sacrifice. For while victory abroad lifted spirits, it also demanded a price at home, a price that would test the nation as surely as any clash of arms. While Wellington carved his victories across the hills of Spain and Portugal, their echoes reached the shores of Britain with a force almost as great as the battles themselves. News traveled slowly in the age before telegraphs, borne on ships and couriers. But when dispatches arrived in London, they carried an electric charge. Crowds gathered around newspaper offices, eager to read the latest reports. The names of Vimeiro, Talavera, Salamanca, and Vittoria spread from Parliament to taverns, from aristocratic salons to humble cottages. Each victory lifted the spirits of a people who had endured years of uncertainty. For the first time since the wars began, Britain could look across the Channel and believe that Napoleon's power might truly be broken. The victories did more than stir pride. They gave the nation a narrative of endurance rewarded. For years, Britain's role had seemed secondary, providing gold to allies, ruling the seas, but unable to challenge Napoleon on land. Now, with Wellington's successes, Britain had a hero to match Nelson, proof that its army, small compared to the legions of Europe, could fight and prevail. Songs were sung, sermons preached, and portraits of the Iron Duke circulated as symbols of national confidence. Wellington became not merely a general, but a symbol of Britain's determination to resist at all costs. Yet beneath the celebrations lay the heavy burden of war, financing coalitions, sustaining the blockade, and supplying armies across the Iberian Peninsula demanded immense resources. Taxes rose, debts mounted, and the economy strained under the weight of prolonged conflict. The cost of bread and basic goods climbed, hitting the poor hardest. Riots and protests flared at times, evidence that not all shared equally in the glow of military triumph. To many families, the war meant sons absent, husbands lost to distant fields, and daily hardship endured in silence. Parliament wrestled with the financial demands. The government of Lord Liverpool, following Pitt's vision, poured gold into the struggle, believing that Britain's wealth was its most decisive weapon. Loans were raised, industries pushed to produce ever more weapons, uniforms, and ships. Critics charged that the war was draining the kingdom, that Britain risked bankruptcy for a cause that seemed endless. But ministers countered that the price of surrender would be far higher: subjugation to Napoleon's Europe, the collapse of empire, and the loss of national independence. And so the nation paid, with coin and sacrifice alike. In this crucible of strain and triumph, something deeper began to form, a spirit that would later be called British resilience. It was not born of easy victories or fleeting glories, but of hardship endured and overcome. Families tightened their belts, communities rallied to support one another, and a shared conviction grew that Britain could withstand anything. Every newspaper report of Wellington's triumph was balanced by the knowledge of what had been spent to achieve it. The very tension between celebration and sacrifice forged a culture of endurance. This resilience was more than stoicism. It was identity. Britons came to see themselves as a people tested by fire, who held firm while others faltered. They looked across the Channel and saw continental powers rise and fall. Prussia crushed, Austria humbled, Russia invaded, while Britain endured, never conquered, never broken. The naval victories of Nelson and the steady advance of Wellington became not only military achievements, but mirrors in which the nation recognized its character. The war also accelerated change at home. Industry expanded to meet demand, fueling the early engines of what would soon become the Industrial Revolution. The financial system adapted, pioneering methods of credit and taxation that allowed the kingdom to sustain a war effort on a scale previously unimaginable. Out of necessity came innovation, and out of adversity came strength. The hardships borne by ordinary people were real and often severe, yet they contributed to a collective sense that Britain was not merely surviving, but transforming. By 1813, as Wellington pressed deeper into Spain and news of Napoleon's difficulties in Russia reached British shores, optimism rose. It seemed at last that the tide had turned, that the long years of sacrifice were yielding reward. The public mood, though tempered by war weariness, hardened into determination. If Britain had endured this far, it could endure until victory was complete. Thus, the war reshaped not only Europe, but Britain itself. It forged a people more conscious of their resilience, more certain of their identity, and more committed to the belief that liberty and endurance were worth any price. When later generations spoke of Britain's character, of its ability to stand firm against storms, they looked back to these years. The peninsular victories, the naval supremacy, the financial sacrifices, all combined to create a narrative of a nation tested and proven. It was in these years, as dispatches from Wellington mingled with rising taxes and rationed bread, that Britain discovered its deepest strength, not in fleeting triumph, nor in prosperity unchallenged, but in resilience. The iron conviction that no matter how long the storm raged, the island would endure. Yet even as Britain endured the strain of sacrifice and found strength in resilience, the course of the wider war was about to shift once more. Across the continent, Napoleon, restless and unyielding, prepared his boldest gamble. If Spain had drained his empire, Russia would test it to the breaking point. In 1812, he turned eastward, gathering an army on a scale Europe had never seen, and with it marched toward a fate that would alter the destiny of nations. In 1812, Napoleon embarked on the most ambitious campaign of his career, a gamble that would decide not only his fate but the fate of Europe. For years, Russia had been a reluctant partner in the continental system, resisting Napoleon's attempt to close every port on the continent to British trade. Tsar Alexander I balked at strangling his own economy for Napoleon's vision of economic warfare. Smuggling flourished, British goods poured into Russia through neutral ports, and tensions mounted. Napoleon, frustrated and determined to enforce his will, resolved to bring the Russian Empire to heel through the sheer weight of arms. Thus was born the invasion of Russia, a campaign grander in scale than anything Europe had ever seen. The Grande Armée, assembled on the banks of the Niemen River, numbered over 600,000 men. French veterans, Polish allies, Italians, Germans, Dutch, and conscripts from across Napoleon's empire. It was not merely an army. It was a continent in arms, a human tide meant to sweep across Russia and crush resistance in a single decisive blow. Napoleon, at the height of his power, believed the campaign would last only a few months. Moscow would fall, Alexander would submit, and Europe would once more bend to his will. But Russia had no intention of offering easy triumphs. As the Grande Armée advanced, Russian generals avoided pitched battles, retreating steadily while scorching the earth behind them. Villages were burned, fields stripped, supplies carried off, leaving the invaders hungry and weary. Napoleon won at Smolensk, pressed on to Borodino, where a day of terrible struggle yielded no decisive result. Though the French claimed victory, the Russians withdrew in order, their army intact. Napoleon marched onward, believing Moscow would be the prize that ended the war. When his troops entered the ancient city in September, they found not submission, but emptiness. Much of the population had fled, and within days, fires consumed the city. Moscow, the symbolic heart of Russia, burned in defiance. Napoleon waited for Alexander to sue for peace, but no envoy came. Days turned into weeks, and the chill of autumn deepened into the bite of winter. Supplies dwindled, morale sagged, and the Grande Armée, far from home, began to wither. The retreat that followed became a march through nightmare. Snow fell, rivers froze, and the once mighty army dissolved into fragments. Horses perished, wagons were abandoned, and men struggled to survive against hunger and frost. Cossack cavalry and Russian patrols harassed the stragglers, but it was the cold and exhaustion that inflicted the greatest toll. By the time the survivors staggered back across the Niemen, fewer than a fraction of the original force remained. From 600,000, barely 100,000 returned fit for service. Napoleon, who had once seemed invincible, was revealed as fallible, his empire shaken to its core. In Britain, the news was received with grim satisfaction. For years, the island had stood alone, blockaded yet unbroken, watching Napoleon dominate the continent. Now, at last, the tide had turned, and it was not British armies or navies that dealt the decisive blow, but Napoleon's own ambition. London's newspapers rejoiced. The emperor had destroyed himself in the snows of Russia. Pitt's strategy of endurance had been vindicated. Britain, through persistence and patience, had outlasted its greatest foe. The consequences rippled quickly across Europe. The French economy, already strained by years of war and blockade, collapsed further under the weight of defeat. Industries faltered, trade routes broke down, and public confidence waned. In Paris, murmurs of dissent grew louder. In the German states, in Italy, and Prussia, subject peoples sensed that the French colossus had stumbled. Allies who once obeyed Napoleon with fear now hesitated, calculating their own survival, as his aura of inevitability faded. For Britain, the disaster in Russia was the opening it had long awaited. With Napoleon weakened, coalitions could be rebuilt. Gold flowed once more from London into the hands of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Wellington pressed forward in Spain, driving French forces back across the Pyrenees. The long years of endurance, the sacrifices at home, the victories on sea and land, all now converged in a moment when France's power was vulnerable. The invasion of Russia thus marked the beginning of the end. What had been conceived as a lightning campaign became a catastrophe that sapped Napoleon's strength and opened the door to his enemies. The emperor who had crowned himself master of Europe now found himself surrounded by foes. His empire shaken, his armies depleted. The myth of invincibility was shattered in the snow outside Moscow, and the consequences would reverberate from Iberia to the German plains. And so, the story turned. The man who had once been unstoppable was now mortal, and the island nation that had endured through blockade and sacrifice saw its chance. Britain, patient and resilient, prepared with its allies to deliver the final blows in a war that had raged for 2 decades. The Russian winter had done what armies could not. It had broken Napoleon's Grande Armée. The path to his downfall now lay open. The snows of Russia had broken the spell of Napoleon's invincibility, but the story was far from over. Across Europe, his enemies sensed weakness and moved to strike. What had begun as murmurs of dissent now swelled into open defiance as kingdoms long subdued found courage to rise. Britain, steadfast through years of endurance, seized the chance to turn survival into triumph. And in 1813, as coalitions reformed and armies gathered, the continent prepared for a confrontation on a scale it had never seen before, the Battle of Nations at Leipzig. After the snows of Russia had shattered the Grande Armée, the map of Europe began to shift with remarkable speed. Napoleon still held immense power, but the spell of his invincibility was broken. Across the continent, old enemies found new courage. Prussia, long humiliated, rose again. Austria, cautious but calculating, prepared to rejoin the struggle. Russia, having survived the invasion, advanced westward with renewed confidence. In 1813, these forces joined Britain to form what became known as the Sixth Coalition, a union of powers determined not merely to contain Napoleon, but to bring him down altogether. For Britain, the opportunity was golden. For 2 decades, the island nation had endured, fighting on the seas, financing allies, and holding its ground in Iberia. Now, at last, the resources it had poured into Europe bore fruit. British gold funded armies, bought supplies, and equipped soldiers from Berlin to Vienna. while Wellington pressed relentlessly in Spain, driving the French back over the Pyrenees. Britain also helped sustain the vast coalitions forming on the continent. Ships ferried material across seas, muskets and uniforms flowed outward, and subsidies strengthened the resolve of allies who might otherwise have wavered. Britain's soldiers were few compared to the millions in continental armies, but its wealth gave the coalition the endurance needed to match Napoleon's skill. The decisive confrontation came in October 1813 at Leipzig. Known as the Battle of Nations, it was the largest clash Europe had ever seen to that point. Over 500,000 men converged in Saxony. Napoleon, with some 200,000, facing a coalition force nearly twice his size. The fields around Leipzig became a vast theater of war, where French, German, Russian, Austrian, Swedish, and Prussian troops fought in a storm of steel and smoke. Napoleon fought with characteristic brilliance. He maneuvered swiftly, seeking to split the enemy forces, striking at one flank before they could fully unite. For days, his veterans resisted, their discipline holding, against overwhelming numbers. But the tide was inexorable. The coalition, sustained by sheer weight of men and resources, pressed in from all sides. The French army, weakened by losses in Russia and stretched thin across Europe, could not match the relentless advance. By the fourth day, Napoleon was forced to order retreat. In the chaos, a bridge was destroyed too soon, cutting off thousands of his troops. The Grande Armée, once a force of destiny, reeled in disorder. Leipzig was more than a defeat. It was a turning point. Napoleon lost over 100,000 men. Allies deserted, and his hold over Germany collapsed. The Confederation of the Rhine, once the foundation of his control in Central Europe, crumbled as princes abandoned him. For the first time, his enemies not only matched his armies, but decisively outnumbered and outfought them. The Battle of Nations had earned its name, as peoples from across Europe joined to push back the French colossus. In Britain, the news was received with jubilation. Parliamentarians spoke of divine providence. Newspapers hailed the downfall of tyranny, and public celebrations erupted across towns and cities. After years of financing the war, of sending subsidies and supplies with little glory to show, Britain now stood at the heart of a great continental triumph. Its role had been indirect on the battlefield of Leipzig, but decisive in making the coalition possible. Without British gold, many armies would not have marched. Without Britain's resilience, the alliance might not have endured. Wellington's victories in Iberia, combined with Leipzig's outcome, created a sense that Napoleon's days were numbered. The French emperor, once the master of Europe, was now retreating toward his borders, his allies slipping away, his aura of supremacy shattered. Britain and its partners in the Sixth Coalition sensed that the final act of the great drama was approaching. The war that had begun with revolution in France was now closing in on France itself. And so, at Leipzig, amid the thunder of cannon and the clash of nations, the tide of history turned. The emperor who had sought to dominate the continent faced the united will of Europe, sustained by the island nation that had never bowed. Napoleon's star, once ascendant, began to fall, and Britain's long endurance was at last rewarded with the promise of victory. Yet Leipzig, though decisive, was not the end. Napoleon still fought on, summoning his genius in one final bid to hold together the remnants of his empire. But the tide that had turned against him in Saxony now rolled inexorably toward France itself. Allies, once cowed, now advanced with confidence, and the emperor who had dictated terms to Europe found himself forced onto the defensive within his own borders. The stage was set for the final act, the abdication of Napoleon and his first exile, not to the palaces of Europe, but to the rocky confines of Elba. In the aftermath of Leipzig, Napoleon fought desperately to salvage his empire. Through the bitter months of 1814, he displayed once more his brilliance on the battlefield, maneuvering against superior forces, striking blows that reminded Europe of his genius. Yet brilliance could no longer alter the tide. The coalition pressed relentlessly forward, its armies entering France itself. For the first time since the Revolution, foreign troops marched on Paris. The spell was broken. In April 1814, Napoleon accepted the unthinkable. He abdicated the throne of France, signing away the empire he had built through 2 decades of war. The once mighty emperor who had crowned himself in Notre Dame and ruled from Madrid to Moscow was sent into exile on the small Mediterranean island of Elba. It was a curious fate. Elba was neither prison nor kingdom, but something in between. Napoleon was allowed to retain the title of emperor, to govern the island's 30,000 inhabitants, and to maintain a small guard. Yet in truth, he was a lion caged, pacing within narrow boundaries. From the heights of Paris to the rocky shores of Elba, his world had shrunk to a handful of villages, his stage reduced from Europe to a speck on the map. For Britain, news of his abdication was cause for celebration. London erupted in joy. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and for a moment it seemed as though the long war was finally over. After 20 years of sacrifice, blockade, and uncertainty, the threat that had loomed so long over the Channel was gone. Merchants dreamed of trade restored, families of peace returned, soldiers of rest after years of campaigning. Yet beneath the jubilation lingered caution. Few in Britain believed that Napoleon's story was truly finished. His name still carried weight, his charisma still commanded loyalty. He was exiled, but not silenced, dethroned, but not erased. Ministers in London watched Elba with wary eyes, aware that a man who had once ruled Europe might not content himself with ruling a rocky isle. The British Navy patrolled the Mediterranean, ready to guard against the possibility, however unlikely, that the lion in his cage might one day slip free. Thus Europe entered a fragile peace. The Bourbon monarchy returned to France, old rulers restored, and Vienna prepared to redraw the map of Europe. But in the minds of many, one question remained. Was Napoleon truly finished? On Elba, the former emperor watched, listened, and waited, his restless mind already plotting. The world exhaled in relief, but the silence was uneasy. For though Napoleon's star had fallen, it had not yet set. Yet the uneasy calm that settled over Europe in 1814 was little more than an interlude. The map was redrawn at Vienna, monarchs restored their thrones, and nations tried to return to old certainties. But across the Mediterranean, on a small rocky isle, the man who had once commanded empires was not resigned. Napoleon's fall had been dramatic, but it was not final. Even in exile, his presence lingered like a storm beyond the horizon, distant for the moment, yet certain to return. And when France grew restless under Bourbon rule, that storm would break again, carrying the eagle back from Elba to Paris, and plunging Europe into one last decisive struggle. The peace that Europe celebrated in 1814 proved to be fragile, for Napoleon's exile to Elba was never the end he accepted. Restless and watchful, the former emperor paced the narrow confines of his island kingdom, listening to rumors of discontent in France. The restored Bourbon monarchy, led by Louis XVIII, struggled to inspire loyalty. Many veterans felt neglected, officers resented the loss of status, and peasants whispered that the glory days had been replaced by incompetence. France, weary of war but proud of its past, found little comfort in its new rulers. Napoleon sensed it. He watched, he waited, and then he acted. In February 1815, he escaped Elba, slipping past the watch of the Allied patrols, and landed on the coast of France with barely 1,000 men. From there began one of the most astonishing marches in history, the Flight of the Eagle. As Napoleon advanced northward, garrison after garrison sent to arrest him instead joined his cause. Soldiers who had once bled for his empire rallied once more to his banner. Crowds gathered to cheer him. The legend returned, not as a fugitive, but as a savior. Within weeks, he reached Paris, and Louis XVIII fled. The emperor had reclaimed his throne without firing a shot. Europe reacted with shock and swift resolve. The Congress of Vienna, still meeting to redraw the map of the continent, was thrown into turmoil. The great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, set aside their disputes and declared Napoleon an outlaw. They pledged armies to march against him once more. This time, there would be no compromise, no truce, no exile short of his final removal. The 100 days had begun, and Europe braced for the storm. Napoleon, though reborn as emperor, knew the odds. His enemies encircled him with overwhelming strength. To win, he would have to move quickly, striking before the coalition armies could unite. He gathered his veterans, the loyal remnants of the Grande Armée, and prepared to march north into Belgium. There he intended to divide and defeat the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Marshal Blucher before they could combine. It was a plan worthy of his old genius. Rapid movement, decisive battle, the hope of breaking the coalition's will before its full weight could fall upon him. In Britain, the return of Napoleon sent shockwaves. The public, fresh from celebrating his downfall, now faced the specter of renewed war. Yet this time they had Wellington, whose triumphs in Spain had made him a figure of trust. Calm, deliberate, and unshaken, he prepared his army, a coalition force of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, to face the challenge. Across the Rhine, Blucher, old and impetuous, readied his Prussians. Together, they formed the twin pillars of the defense against Napoleon's return. As spring unfolded, the armies converged. Napoleon moved swiftly, defeating the Prussians at Ligny on June 16th, even as his Marshal Ney clashed inconclusively with Wellington at Quatre Bras. The stage was set for the great confrontation. 2 days later, near the village of Waterloo, the emperor and his enemies prepared for the battle that would decide Europe's fate. In those tense days, Europe held its breath. Napoleon had returned from exile to reclaim his empire, and once more the continent trembled at his audacity. Yet this time he faced not a divided coalition, but a united will, hardened by years of war, sustained by British wealth, and led by commanders determined to end the cycle. The 100 Days had begun with the Eagle's triumphant flight from Elba to Paris. It would end in fields soaked by rain and thundered by cannon, with the final reckoning of an age. Thus Europe braced itself for the reckoning. Napoleon had returned in triumph, his eagle soaring once more from Elba to Paris. But now the emperor's fate, and the fate of the continent, would be decided not in palaces or Congress halls, but on a field of mud and blood. As his veterans marched north into Belgium and Wellington and Blucher drew their forces into line, all roads converged toward a single point, Waterloo. And on the night of June 17th, as the skies opened and rain poured upon the waiting armies, destiny itself seemed to weigh down the sodden earth, preparing the stage for the final clash. The night of June 17th, 1815, fell heavy with rain. Dark clouds gathered over the Belgian countryside, and the heavens opened in torrents. Roads turned to rivers of mud, fields into quagmires. Men and horses alike sank knee-deep in the mire as they trudged toward their positions. The Grande Armée and the Anglo-Allied army alike were drenched, their uniforms clinging to their bodies, their boots filled with water. Fires sputtered and died in the downpour, leaving soldiers to shiver through the night with little warmth or rest. It was as though nature itself had conspired to mark the eve of destiny with misery. Through the storm, the two armies inched closer to the clash that would decide the fate of Europe. Napoleon's men camped in sodden fields, their artillery bogged down in mud, wheels stuck, horses exhausted. On the opposite ridge, Wellington's army held their ground, scattered across farmhouses and muddy slopes. Neither side could advance in the storm, but both knew that once the rain cleared, the world would change forever. By morning, June 18th, the rain subsided, but the battlefield remained a mire. The trampled earth, soaked and slick, promised to slow the cavalry and swallow the guns. As the day unfolded, the thunder of hooves echoed across the fields, for Napoleon sent forth wave after wave of cavalry against the British lines. The sight was both terrible and magnificent. Thousands of horsemen, cuirassiers in gleaming breastplates, lances glinting, charged across the mud toward the thin red and blue lines of the Anglo-Allied army. The ground shook beneath the weight of hooves, the sound rolling like thunder over the ridge. Against this tide of steel and muscle, Wellington's infantry braced for impact. It was here that the discipline of the British soldier revealed its worth. Instead of breaking ranks, the men formed the famous infantry squares, compact formations, bayonets bristling outward like a living fortress. From above, they resembled great dice scattered across the muddy fields, small islands of defiance amid the storm. Cavalry swept around them, circling, probing for weakness, but the squares held firm. Horses reared at the hedge of steel. Riders wheeled away, charge after charge dissolving against the unyielding walls of men. For hours the pattern repeated. French cavalry surged forward only to recoil against the steady squares. The soldiers within stood shoulder to shoulder, drenched, exhausted, but unbroken. Drums beat within the formations, officers shouted encouragement, and the men fired in disciplined volleys when the enemy pressed too close. Every man knew that a broken square meant annihilation, yet not a single square collapsed. To those who watched, it was as though the island spirit of Britain itself had taken shape in mud and steel. The squares were more than tactics. They were symbols of resilience. Against the greatest cavalry of Europe, against charge after charge, the infantry endured. The battle was far from over, but in those hours of relentless pressure, the resolve of Wellington's army shone with a brilliance that no storm, no mud, no enemy could extinguish. Night had begun in rain and misery, but the day brought the spectacle of endurance. Small clusters of men defying the fury of an empire. The fields of Waterloo were soaked, not just by storms, but by the weight of history pressing down upon them. And amid the mud, the rain, and the roar of hooves, the square became immortal. Yet even as the squares held through the fury of cavalry and the long hours of pounding artillery, the day was far from done. The mud, the smoke, and the relentless pressure had drained Wellington's army, leaving it battered but still standing. Across the valley, Napoleon watched with growing urgency. Time was slipping away, and the storm gathering on his flank warned that Blucher's Prussians were drawing ever nearer. Morning and midday had tested the endurance of both sides. Now the evening would decide everything. And so, as the light began to fade on June 18th, the Emperor turned at last to his final weapon, the Imperial Guard. The afternoon of June 18th, 1815, dragged on under a sky still heavy with storm clouds. The fields of Waterloo, churned into mud by rain and hooves, had become a vast arena of endurance. Hours of assaults had tested Wellington's army to the limit. Ney's cavalry had thundered against the squares, artillery had pounded the ridge, and French infantry had pressed again and again. Yet the Anglo-Allied line held. Exhausted, diminished, but unbroken, Wellington's men clung to their positions. By early evening, Napoleon knew time was running short. To the east, the Prussians, under Blucher, were drawing nearer, their advance already threatening his flank. If he could not shatter Wellington before they arrived in force, his campaign, and perhaps his throne, would be lost. It was then that he turned to his last reserve, the elite of his army, the Imperial Guard. The Guard was more than soldiers. It was a symbol. Veterans chosen for their loyalty and bravery. Men who had marched with Napoleon from Italy to Egypt, from Austerlitz to Moscow. They were the very embodiment of his empire, revered by friend and feared by foe. When the Guard moved, it was as though the will of Napoleon himself strode onto the battlefield. Their advance was a message to both armies. This was the final throw of the dice. As drums rolled and eagles glinted in the dimming light, the Guard marched up the slope toward Wellington Center. The exhausted Allied troops watched as these giants in bearskins and polished bayonets advanced in perfect order. The French line surged with hope, believing that one more push would break the enemy. Cries of "Vive l'Empereur" echoed across the mud. On the ridge, Wellington remained calm. For hours he had held back, refusing to commit his reserves, steadying his line with brief words, riding slowly along the front as his men fought. Now, as the Guard drew nearer, he sensed the moment. His officers leaned in, waiting, and at last Wellington gave the signal. "Now is the time, gentlemen." The order spread like fire. Allied troops who had lain concealed behind the ridge surged forward. Muskets cracked in rolling volleys, blasting into the flanks of the Guard. From the ridge itself, disciplined lines rose and poured fire into the advancing columns. The Guard staggered but pressed on, step after relentless step. Yet the storm of shot was too fierce. The proud columns faltered, wavered, and then, in a moment that resounded across the field, began to fall back. The cry went up, "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats. It was a phrase no French soldier had ever heard, a blow not just to the body, but to the spirit of the army. What had been hope turned to dread. Panic rippled through the French ranks as the symbol of invincibility gave way. Seizing the moment, Wellington's army surged forward. At the same time, Blucher's Prussians arrived on the French flank, crashing into their lines with fresh force. The Allied counterattack rolled like a wave, sweeping down the ridge, pressing the retreat into a rout. Napoleon's once proud army dissolved into chaos, streaming back across the fields they had crossed with such confidence in the morning. As night fell over Waterloo, the battle was decided. Napoleon, who had risen from exile to reclaim an empire, now saw it shattered in a single day. The Imperial Guard, his last reserve, had been broken. Wellington, calm and steadfast, and Blucher, fierce and relentless, had together sealed the fate of Europe. Waterloo was not merely a battle, it was the climax of an age. The rise and fall of empires, the decades of revolution and war, all converged on this muddy field in Belgium. And when the smoke cleared, it was not the eagle of Napoleon that soared, but the endurance of nations united in resolve. The man who had once commanded the continent now faced the twilight of his destiny, and the world entered a new chapter. Thus, as darkness settled over Waterloo and the echoes of cannon fire faded into the night, the outcome was beyond doubt. Napoleon's final gamble had failed, and with it, the fate of his empire was sealed. What remained was no longer the clash of arms, but the reckoning that follows defeat, the decisions of allies, the judgment of nations, and the exile of a man who had once bestrode Europe like a colossus. The thunder of Waterloo faded into the summer night, but its consequences shook Europe with the force of an earthquake. The dream of Napoleon's restored empire ended not with triumph, but with collapse. Within days of his defeat, he abdicated for the second and final time. No longer could he hope for compromise or a negotiated peace. The Allies were united in one demand. Napoleon must be removed from the stage of Europe once and for all. This time there would be no Elba, no island from which he might return to stir the world again. Instead, he was sent to the far reaches of the Atlantic, to the lonely island of St. Helena. Windswept, remote, and beyond the reach of intrigue, it was the perfect prison for a man whose very presence could unsettle kingdoms. Here, amid the rocky outcrops and endless ocean horizon, the emperor who had once commanded Europe's destiny would live out his days in exile. The eagle had soared across continents, but its final perch was a speck of land lost in the sea. Back in Britain, news of victory transformed Wellington into a national icon. Already celebrated for his campaigns in Spain, Waterloo elevated him to legendary status. The calm endurance with which he had faced Napoleon's might, the steady hand that had guided his coalition army through the storm, became symbols of Britain itself. Crowds cheered his name, artists painted his image, and Parliament honored him as the man who had delivered Europe from tyranny. Nelson had embodied the spirit of the Navy. Wellington now embodied the strength of the army. Together, they stood as twin heroes of a nation that had defied the greatest of challenges. Yet amid the celebration, there was also reflection. The war that had begun with the French Revolution had consumed a generation. It had cost treasure, lives, and decades of uncertainty. But it had also reshaped Britain's place in the world. The defeat of Napoleon marked the beginning of a century in which Britain would stand unrivaled at sea, ascendant in trade and empire. The island nation that had endured, resisted, and triumphed now stepped into a new era, its resilience confirmed, its destiny enlarged. For Europe, the end of Napoleon meant a fragile peace, secured at the Congress of Vienna and sealed on the muddy fields of Belgium. For Britain, it meant triumph and sacrifice bound together in memory. And for Napoleon himself, it meant silence at the edge of the world. His voice carried no longer in thunderous commands, but only in the whispers of history. Yet the thunder of Waterloo, though it silenced Napoleon's ambitions, did not bring silence to Britain itself. Victory carried with it not only glory, but weight. The cannons had ceased, the eagle had fallen, and Europe exhaled in relief. Yet the island nation that had endured 2 decades of war now faced a different kind of battle. Peace, long yearned for, arrived not as simple rest, but as a reckoning. The empire's coffers were drained by years of subsidies and blockades. Its soldiers returned home to uncertain futures, and its industries, hardened by the demands of war, now clamored for new markets. Behind the ringing of church bells and the waving of flags, questions stirred. How would Britain bear the burden of debt, absorb the tide of veterans, and answer the rising voices of workers who demanded more than survival. Waterloo had crowned Britain with triumph, but triumph alone could not resolve the challenges of a society transformed by revolution abroad and industry at home. The world had entered a fragile peace, and Britain, though victorious, would discover that peace carried trials of its own. The guns of Waterloo had scarcely fallen silent when Britain confronted the immense weight of peace. Victory over Napoleon had been secured, but the long struggle left scars as deep as triumphs. The island nation emerged stronger, richer in prestige, yet also burdened with debts, divisions, and dilemmas that would shape the coming century. Economically, the war years had drained the treasury. National debt soared to levels unprecedented in British history. The price of financing coalitions, sustaining the navy, and supplying armies across continents. Taxes remained high, and hardship lingered for many. Yet alongside this burden came opportunity. With France defeated and continental ports reopening, Britain's merchant fleet spread outward with renewed vigor. The Royal Navy, unchallenged on the seas, guaranteed safe passage for British goods. Markets in India, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Asia beckoned. Manufactured textiles, metal goods, and colonial products flowed across oceans, binding the world to Britain's trade networks. What had been a wartime necessity, global reach, became in peace the foundation of an empire of commerce. But prosperity was not evenly shared. The return of soldiers seeking work, coupled with the mechanization of industries, produced economic dislocation. In textile towns, the rise of machines threatened traditional craftsmen. The Luddites, bands of workers who smashed industrial machinery, expressed desperation more than ideology. Their protests were suppressed, but they revealed the tension of a society caught between old ways and new industry. Hunger, unemployment, and high prices plagued the working classes, and with them came demands for change. Social unrest was not confined to factories. The spread of ideas born of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, representation, echoed among reformers in Britain. Meetings and pamphlets called for broader suffrage, fair representation, and relief for the poor. The ruling class, however, fearful of revolutionary contagion, resisted. Parliament remained in the hands of the landed elite, cautious and conservative, determined to preserve stability above all. Reforms were delayed, dissent was monitored, and public gatherings were sometimes dispersed by force. The memory of France's turmoil lingered as a warning. Liberty, if uncontrolled, could become chaos. Yet repression could not silence the questions. The Industrial Revolution, already underway, was transforming Britain's social fabric. Towns swelled with migrants from the countryside, factories multiplied, and a new working class began to find its voice. The years after the Napoleonic Wars thus became a crucible in which economic growth, social unrest, and political conservatism collided. Out of this tension would eventually emerge reform, but for the moment Britain balanced uneasily between pride in victory and anxiety about unrest. Politically, the shadow of revolution loomed large. The government, led by conservative ministries, feared both domestic insurrection and foreign upheaval. At home, the Peterloo Massacre of 1819 would later symbolize the clash between reformers and authority. Abroad, Britain took on a new role, guardian of continental order. At the Congress of Vienna, British diplomats helped design a balance of power meant to prevent another Napoleon. With its navy dominating the seas and its gold sustaining allies, Britain emerged as the policeman of Europe, ready to intervene when revolutions threatened stability. This role was not purely altruistic. Britain's leaders understood that peace on the continent meant freedom to expand abroad. The Royal Navy, unchallenged since Trafalgar, patrolled oceans as far as the Pacific. British ships suppressed piracy, protected trade, and increasingly turned toward the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade. Empire became not merely a byproduct of commerce, but an instrument of national identity. The Union Jack flew in distant ports, and London became the financial hub of a world system of exchange. In cultural imagination, Britain's triumph over Napoleon reinforced an image of resilience, order, and destiny. The nation that had stood alone now stood preeminent. Its institutions had survived revolution and war. Its fleets commanded the seas. Its generals had defeated Europe's greatest conqueror. Yet beneath this confidence lay contradictions. The working poor struggled, reform was resisted, and debt weighed heavily. Britain was both triumphant and troubled, a victor whose laurels rested uneasily on the brow. Still, the post-war years laid the foundation for the century that followed. Britain would not withdraw into isolation, but extend its influence across the globe. It would balance between repression and reform at home, while projecting power abroad as the guarantor of order. From the smoke of Waterloo emerged not only a victorious nation, but the outlines of a global empire, one that would shape the modern world. Thus, as the cannons fell silent and the exiles of St. Helena faded into the Atlantic, Britain entered a new age. It had endured the greatest storm of modern history and emerged not broken, but ascendant. The cost had been immense, the sacrifices profound, but out of them rose the framework of an empire that would claim the 19th century as its own. Yet peace, though hard won, was never simply the absence of war. Beneath the quiet that followed Waterloo lay echoes that would not fade. Britain had emerged from the struggle exhausted yet exalted, scarred by sacrifice yet strengthened by triumph. The debts of war could be repaid, the protests of workers could be suppressed, but the memory of 2 decades of resistance against Napoleon could not be so easily set aside. Out of hardship and endurance came something deeper, a story that Britons told themselves, a conviction that their nation had stood firm when all others faltered, and it was this memory, more than cannons or treaties, that endured. For what Britain carried into the new century was not only power and empire, but a legacy, the sense that from Trafalgar to Waterloo, from blockade to victory, its people had forged an identity of resilience, unity, and destiny that would define the age to come. The end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 did not simply close a chapter of history, it carved a legacy that defined Britain for a century to come. The decades of struggle against revolutionary and imperial France had cost treasure and lives beyond reckoning, but they left behind something more enduring, a sense of identity, power, and destiny. For Britain, the wars were not just a contest of armies, but a crucible in which national character was forged. At the heart of this legacy was the idea of unity. For 20 years, through setbacks and sacrifices, Britain had endured. Blockades, threats of invasion, economic strain, all tested the resilience of the nation. Yet the island stood firm. The victories at Trafalgar and Waterloo became not merely military triumphs, but symbols of national spirit, proof that courage and perseverance could withstand even the greatest adversary of the age. From the, humblest sailor to the grandest duke, Britain shared in the conviction that their endurance had preserved not only their freedom, but also the balance of Europe. In this collective memory, the wars gave birth to a stronger sense of what it meant to be British. Steadfast, resilient, and destined for greatness. Militarily, the wars elevated 2 figures to near mythic status. Horatio Nelson, who fell at Trafalgar, embodied the daring and sacrifice of the Royal Navy. His victories secured command of the seas, ensuring that Napoleon's dreams of crossing the Channel remained forever unfulfilled. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, embodied a different kind of heroism, patient, disciplined, unflinching. His victories in the Peninsular War and at Waterloo showed that British arms could triumph on land as surely as on sea. Together, Nelson and Wellington became twin pillars of martial legend, invoked for generations as models of leadership and resolve. Their names adorned streets, squares, and monuments. Their faces appeared in paintings and engravings. Their deeds echoed in the speeches of statesmen and the songs of poets. Diplomatically, the wars reshaped Britain's place in the world. At the Congress of Vienna, British diplomats led by Castlereagh helped craft a new European order. The balance of power they forged sought to prevent another hegemon from rising, to preserve peace through equilibrium. Britain, with its unrivaled navy and global commerce, emerged not merely as a participant, but as a superpower, the arbiter of continental affairs and the guardian of international order. From 1815 onward, Britain became the workshop of diplomacy, as well as the workshop of industry, wielding influence not only through armies, but also through treaties, coalitions, and trade. The wars had propelled the nation into a position of global supremacy, a role it would maintain throughout the 19th century. Culturally, the memory of the wars seeped into the imagination of Britain and beyond. Poets captured the grandeur and tragedy of the age. Byron's fiery verses evoked the drama of empires clashing, while Wordsworth's meditations spoke of the toll on human spirit and the yearning for peace. Painters such as J.M.W. Turner immortalized naval battles in swirls of light and storm, transforming the clash of ships into visions of sublime power. Memorials rose in city squares, statues of Nelson and Wellington stood as guardians of national pride, and the Union Jack itself became not only a flag, but a symbol of sacrifice and triumph. For ordinary people, too, the wars lived on in memory. Veterans told stories of the Peninsula and Waterloo, sailors recalled the thunder of Trafalgar, and families bore the scars of absence and hardship. Yet these sacrifices were woven into a broader story, that of a nation which had endured the storm and emerged stronger. The memory of shared struggle created bonds that reached across class and region, fostering a sense of common destiny. As the 19th century unfolded, these legacies coalesced into what would be known as the Pax Britannica. With Napoleon defeated, Britain stood unrivaled at sea, expanding its empire and policing trade routes from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The wealth of commerce, the might of the Navy, and the stability of domestic institutions gave Britain a role as arbiter of global affairs. The wars had shown not only that Britain could survive, but that it could lead. In diplomacy, in industry, in culture, Britain now carried the mantle of world power. The cinematic image of this legacy is one of sails and standards, of the Union Jack unfurling across oceans, fluttering in distant ports, and rising above new colonies. Behind it lies the memory of decades of struggle, the squares at Waterloo standing firm against cavalry, Nelson's signal at Trafalgar snapping in the wind, Wellington's iron gaze at Salamanca and Vittoria. These were not only moments in time, but foundations of identity, stones in the edifice of an empire that would shape the modern world. Thus, the Napoleonic Wars, with all their burdens and glories, gave Britain more than victory. They gave it a story to tell itself, a narrative of endurance and triumph, sacrifice and destiny. From the bloodied fields of Europe to the painted canvases of Turner, from the verses of Byron to the halls of Parliament, the wars carved Britain into something new, a nation conscious of its power, confident in its resilience, and poised to stride across the world. And so, as the 19th century dawned, the guns of Waterloo echoed still, not in thunder, but in memory. The eagle of Napoleon had fallen, but the flag of Britain flew high, heralding an age of mastery. The legacy of those long wars was not merely the defeat of a conqueror, but the birth of an empire of peace, Pax Britannica, whose shadow would stretch across the century to come. Thus, the memory of the Napoleonic Wars did not fade with the treaties signed at Vienna or the celebrations in London. Instead, it deepened, echoing across poetry, painting, politics, and public life. Britain carried forward not only the triumphs of Trafalgar and Waterloo, but also the sacrifices and resilience that had sustained those victories. Out of the hardship of 2 decades emerged a nation conscious of its destiny, aware that its endurance had earned it a voice in shaping the world. It was in this sense that the legacy of the wars passed seamlessly into the next chapter. The smoke of Waterloo was more than the end of a battle. It was the threshold of an age. And as the waves broke upon distant shores carrying the Union Jack to ports across the globe, Britain stepped into its new role with confidence, poised between memory and mastery. As the smoke of Waterloo drifted into memory and the waves of St. Helena closed around a fallen emperor, Britain stood at the threshold of a new age. The island that had once stood alone against the might of Napoleon now looked outward across the oceans, its flag a constant presence from the Atlantic to the Indian Seas. The long wars had tested its endurance, drained its coffers, and cost it dearly. But in the crucible of struggle, it had discovered its destiny. The names of Nelson and Wellington were etched into stone and story, their courage woven into the nation's soul. The poems of Byron and Wordsworth, the visions of Turner, the voices of ordinary men and women, all carried forward the memory of an age when Britain had held fast against the storm. Out of sacrifice was born a century of influence, when the Union Jack became not merely a banner, but the emblem of a world order. And so, from Trafalgar to Waterloo, from the Channel to the distant seas, Britain emerged not just as a victor, but as a guardian of a fragile peace. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, but their echoes lingered. In every port where British ships anchored, in every treaty signed under London's gaze, in every tale of endurance told by firesides, the eagle of Napoleon had fallen. In its place, the Lion of Britain roared across a century. The age of revolution had closed. The age of empire had begun.